Dear listeners, welcome. The classic mysteries taught us something important, that the truth is almost never where you first look for it. It hides in the corners, in the pauses, in the things people choose not to say. Tonight, we pay very close attention to all of those things. But before the first clue appears, I want to hear from you. Where are you right now, and what kind of day have you had? A long one? A quiet one? A complicated one? Leave a comment and share a small piece of your world. Tonight's tale is a fan-made production, made with deep respect for the classic mystery tradition. No rights claimed. Now, pay attention. The first clue may come sooner than you expect. Murder at Black Hollow Road. A Miss Marple mystery. The key was the wrong size for the lock it was supposed to fit. Miss Marple had noticed it at the fête, 3 days before Gerald Ashford's death, on a Thursday afternoon that smelled of bruised grass and fried onions and the particular sweetness of October apples left too long in a basket. She had not thought much of it at the time. Gerald Ashford stood near the tombola stall with his hand in his waistcoat pocket, and she had assumed, as one naturally does, that it was a watch he kept touching. But it wasn't a watch. It was a key. She could see the shape of it through the worn wool, too small and flat for a door, too deliberate in how he held it. She had thought, he is ill. Then she had looked at his face and thought again. Ill men look inward. They carry their body like something borrowed and troublesome. Gerald Ashford was looking outward, at the lane, at the gate, at the faces of people who passed him and said good afternoon, and moved on. He was watching for someone. Or watching to see that someone was not there. That was fear. Miss Marple had spent a long life learning the difference. The news arrived on Monday morning with the butcher's boy. He was perhaps 15, red-faced from cycling, and he smelled powerfully of cold liver and bicycle chain grease. He handed Mrs. Fellows, the widow Miss Marple was visiting, a small, fierce woman who grew dahlias and distrusted the telephone, a wrapped parcel, and then said, in the slightly important tone of someone carrying information they know to be significant, "Did you hear about Mr. Ashford up at Black Hollow? Died in the night, they're saying. Doctor was there by 6 this morning." Mrs. Fellows made a sound. The boy, satisfied, cycled away. Miss Marple was in the hall. She had come down for her 7 o'clock cup of tea and was standing with it still in her hand when the front door opened and closed, and Mrs. Fellows came back inside with the parcel and a particular look on her face. The look of someone who has received news they do not quite know what to do with. "Gerald Ashford," Mrs. Fellows said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I heard." She drank her tea. She thought about the key. She thought about the smell of ink she had caught on Gerald Ashford's jacket at the fête, the smell of a man who had spent the morning writing something, and she thought about his face, and the difference between ill and frightened, and the fact that frightened men, in her experience, were usually frightened for a reason that had not gone away simply because they had. She set her cup down on the hall table. "I think," she said, "I might walk up to Black Hollow this morning. To pay one's respects. It's only proper." Mrs. Fellows looked at her. They had known each other for 31 years. "Of course," said Mrs. Fellows, in a tone that meant, "I know perfectly well what you are doing." Black Hollow Road ran from the village high street to the far edge of the parish, where the properties thinned out and the hedgerows grew tall and unkempt, and the light had a way of going flat and grey, even on mornings that were bright everywhere else. The road was chalk pale in the October cold, the surface cracked and ridged from last winter's frost, and Miss Marple walked it slowly, her stick testing each uneven patch with the practiced care of a woman who has learned that a broken wrist at 74 is not an inconvenience, but a catastrophe. Black Hollow House announced itself before it was visible. There was a smell to the property, damp stone and old yew, and something sweetly fungal from the garden. The smell of a house that had been old for so long it had stopped trying to be otherwise. The gate stood open. The garden beyond it was the kind that had once been managed, and had then, over years, been managed rather less, and now was in a state of slightly accusing disorder. Hedges that wanted cutting, a rose arch that had lost 2 of its 3 uprights and leaned at an angle, grass that was still green but growing in the wrong directions. Miss Marple went through the gate. She did not go to the front door. She went, instead, around the side of the house to the kitchen entrance, a route she had learned from Mrs. Fellows, who had been a social caller here for years and knew the etiquette of the place. Front door for the family's guests, kitchen door for everyone the family actually talked to. Mrs. Patten answered on the second knock. She was 62, or thereabouts, with the kind of face that had been handsome 20 years ago and was now something better, lived in, specific, honest. She wore a grey house dress and a dark cardigan, and she was carrying, somewhat incongruously, a tin of furniture polish. Her eyes were red at the rims, but she was not crying now, and she looked at Miss Marple with the expression of a woman who has cried her share and moved on to the practical matter of getting through the day. "Miss Marple," she said. She did not sound surprised. In a village the size of Wendenmere, surprise at callers was something people had mostly given up. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said. "I only wanted to say how very sorry I am. I had spoken with Mr. Ashford at the fête, you know. A pleasant conversation. He seemed, well, I was sorry to hear." She caught herself on the word and did not use it. Gerald Ashford had not seemed anything. He had been. She filed the near slip away. Mrs. Patten opened the door wider. The kitchen smelled of toast and beeswax, and, faintly, something medicinal. Not unpleasant, but present, the way a smell lingers after the thing that caused it has been removed. Miss Marple came in and sat in the chair she was offered at the kitchen table, and accepted the cup of tea she was given, and said the things one says. What a shock! How sudden! A man his age, of course, but still, and let Mrs. Patten talk. Mrs. Patten was the kind of woman who talked in order to keep from thinking, and so she talked well, and at length, and Miss Marple listened with the particular quality of attention she had cultivated over many decades, which looked like the vague sympathy of an elderly lady, but was in fact as sharp and retentive as a court reporter. Gerald Ashford had been found at 5:30 in the morning by Mrs. Patten herself, when she came down to begin the kitchen range. He was in his study. He was in his chair. The doctor had been called and had come and had said, heart failure, entirely consistent with his history, not unexpected in a man of 71, with 2 previous episodes and a constitution that had been, in Mrs. Patten's word, fragile for the past 2 years. The death certificate had been signed by 9 o'clock. Dr. Lovell was very thorough. He hadn't been himself lately, Mrs. Patten said. She was polishing the same section of the table with the cloth she'd been holding since Miss Marple arrived, round and round. Worried about something, I thought. Wouldn't say what. Mr. Gerald never did say what. Kept things to himself. Quite, said Miss Marple. A private man. Very private. Everything locked. Every drawer. She said it without complaint. It was simply a fact of the house. He'd had the locks changed on his study in August. New key cut. Just the one, and he kept it himself. Miss Marple thought about the waistcoat pocket, about the shape beneath the wool. One key, and he kept it himself, and he was frightened. She looked, not obviously, at the kitchen, at the draining rack beside the sink, which held 3 plates, 2 mugs, a saucepan lid, a colander, 2 sets of cutlery, and a teapot stand. No cocoa cup. It was a small thing. The sort of thing that mattered only if you knew it should be there. Mr. Ashford took cocoa in the evening, Miss Marple asked, with the air of someone making idle conversation. Every night since 1987, Mrs. Patten said, and something crossed her face. A flicker, gone almost at once, but there, without fail. I do find it comforting, Miss Marple said pleasantly. A routine, especially living alone, as he did. Well, not quite alone, of course. There is the young woman, isn't there? The cousin." Mrs. Patton's cloth stopped moving. "Miss Cole," she said. "Yes." The way she said it contained more information than the words themselves. Miss Marple, who had spent a great many years listening to what people put into the spaces around their sentences, heard all of it. She did not push. She finished her tea. She thanked Mrs. Patton for her kindness, expressed again her condolences, and said she hoped the coming days would not be too difficult. At the kitchen door, she paused. "I always wash my breakfast things up first thing," she said, in her vaguest voice. "Force of habit. Do you find the same?" 8 o'clock, Mrs. Patton said, and her voice had gone careful. "Always 8. I'm regular about it." "How sensible," said Miss Marple. "One likes a clean rack." She went back down Black Hollow Road in the flat October light, her stick tapping the chalk-pale surface at measured intervals, and thought about a cup that was not there, and a key that was, and a woman who had said, "Miss Cole," in exactly the tone that Mrs. Purvis of Chipping Barton had once used, 30 years ago, when asked about the young woman her husband's uncle had recently taken in. Mrs. Purvis's uncle had died in February. The young woman had inherited a house and £1,400. Miss Marple had been too late then. She did not intend to be too late now. Diana Cole opened the door herself. That was the first thing. Black Hollow House had a bell, and Black Hollow House had a housekeeper, and in Miss Marple's experience of houses like this one, Victorian, draughty, governed by 30 years of Mrs. Patton's particular domestic order, a caller at the front door was answered by the housekeeper, not by a guest who had been in residence for 6 weeks and had no particular standing in the household. Diana Cole answered the door as though she owned it. The gesture was small. The implications were not. She was 31, perhaps 32, tall, with dark hair cut close and grey eyes that held a quality Miss Marple could only describe, privately, as professional warmth, the warmth of a woman who had decided to be warm and executed it well, and had been executing it long enough that it no longer required conscious effort. She wore a charcoal wool dress with a white collar, which managed simultaneously to convey grief and composure, and she held a small handkerchief that she was not crying into and had not recently been crying into, though its presence made the suggestion. "Miss Marple," she said, "how kind of you to come." She said it as though she had been expecting her. Miss Marple said the appropriate things and was shown into the drawing-room, which smelled of cold grate and chrysanthemums, the specific chrysanthemum smell of late autumn, sharp and faintly bitter, the smell of flowers brought in for a funeral before the funeral has been arranged. Someone had filled 3 vases with them. The room was otherwise very much as Miss Marple had pictured it from Mrs. Fellowes' descriptions. A high ceiling with water staining at one corner, heavy curtains in a claret colour that had been expensive 30 years ago, a great deal of furniture, and a mantelpiece crowded with the objects of a long life, photographs, small bronzes, a pair of candlesticks that needed cleaning, a jade elephant, a rosewood clock that had stopped at 4:20. Diana poured tea from a tray that had been laid before Miss Marple's arrival. She poured with the ease of a woman who had been pouring tea in this room long enough to know where the cups were kept, and how the pot poured, and at what angle one held it to avoid the drip. 6 weeks, Miss Marple reflected, was long enough for that. "Just such a dreadful shock," Diana said. Though the doctor had been warning us, Gerald's heart had been, well, it wasn't strong. "No," said Miss Marple, "I believe he'd had some episodes. 2, in the past 4 years. Diana's hands were still around her own cup, chalk-white hands, fine-boned, quite steady. He was not a man who looked after himself. I'd been trying to... She stopped, gathered herself. One does what one can. It was very good. The pause, the gathering, the unfinished sentence that implied devoted care without claiming it outright. Miss Marple had watched a great many performances in her long life, and she knew that the very best ones were the ones that appeared not to be performances at all. Diana Cole's grief was pitch perfect. The handkerchief, the steady hands that were too steady, the carefully incomplete sentences. Too much salt, Miss Marple thought again. A dish that wants you to notice it has been seasoned, she asked, in her pleasantest voice, how Diana and Gerald had come to know each other. Diana explained. A distant connection. On Gerald's mother's side, 3 generations back. They had corresponded for years, she said, though never met. Then, this summer, she had been passing through Worcestershire and had written to ask if she might call. Gerald he'd been lonely, she thought. He was that kind of man, self-sufficient to a fault, which is another word for isolated. He'd asked her to stay. How fortunate that you were here, Miss Marple said. When it happened, I mean. Not to be alone. Yes. A small pause. Though I almost wasn't. I'd been thinking of leaving, of going back to London. What changed your mind? Another pause, slightly longer. Gerald asked me to stay. He said he had things to put in order. He wanted company while he did it. Things to put in order. Miss Marple filed that away beside the new key and the missing cup and the fresh ink smell of the fête. She looked around the drawing room with the expression of a woman who finds old rooms interesting. The mantelpiece, the photographs, the jade elephant, the rosewood clock stopped at 4:20. What a lovely room, she said. I notice you have, is that a George III escritoire, near the window? Diana glanced toward it. I believe so. Gerald's, obviously. I don't know much about furniture, I'm afraid. And the study, next door. I imagine he spent most of his time there. Yes, all his papers are in there. Everything's... She stopped again. Something moved across her face, very briefly, and then was gone. The room's locked, of course, until the solicitors have been in. Quite right, said Miss Marple. One doesn't want things disturbed. She paused, and then, as if struck by a mild curiosity, I suppose all his papers would be in the left-hand pedestal desk. I remember from when I visited years ago, Gerald had that rather fine Victorian partner's desk, didn't he? He kept his personal correspondence in the left-hand drawer. She had never visited Black Hollow House in her life, Diana said, without hesitation. That's right, though the left-hand pedestal was always kept locked. I know he had a drawer for the important things. He was very organized about it. Miss Marple let that sit for a moment. How reassuring, she said. Philip Ashford was in the Crossed Keys by 6:30. Miss Marple knew this because Mrs. Fellowes' gardener, Mr. Hawke, had mentioned it at the gate while raking leaves, in the way that people in villages mention things. Not to gossip. They were always careful to say, simply to note. Philip Ashford had been at the Keys most evenings since Monday. He was Gerald's nephew. He was 34. He drank whiskey, Mr. Hawke said, with the slightly pained expression of a man who considered this a character failing, and he talked. Miss Marple went to the Crossed Keys at 7 o'clock and ordered a small sherry. The pub smelled of old beer and wood smoke, and the faintly sweet rot of the oak beams overhead. A smell she associated with honesty, or at least with the loosening of the guard that preceded it. Philip Ashford was at the bar. She recognized him from the fête, where he had stood at the edge of the lawn and looked at Gerald Ashford with the expression of a man calculating something. He was good-looking in a used sort of way. Dark, like Diana, though there was nothing else similar about them. Where Diana was composed, Philip was fractured. His jacket was yesterday's, his eyes moved too quickly, and he held his glass the way people hold things when they are not sure what to do with their hands. She sat 2 stools along. She ordered her sherry. She said, to no one in particular, what a sad business it was about Mr. Ashford up at Black Hollow. Philip Ashford turned and looked at her. You knew him. His voice was younger than his face. Slightly, she said. I am visiting Mrs. Fellowes. Your uncle and she were acquainted. I spoke with him at the fête, a very contained sort of man. Philip gave a short sound that was not quite a laugh. That's one word. He looked at his glass. He looked at the bar, which was scrubbed wood and needed nothing from him. I'm his nephew, he said, as though she hadn't known. Philip Ashford. How very difficult this must be. Miss Marple said. The sympathy in her voice was not performed. She meant it. This was a frightened young man who was guilty of being in debt and of loving his uncle imperfectly and perhaps of other small failures, but she did not believe he was guilty of what the shape of things currently suggested he might be guilty of. And that belief was enough to make her want to listen to him carefully. He talked. He talked for 40 minutes, with 2 more whiskies. He told her about the debts. Not in so many words, but in the way that financially desperate people circle a subject, approaching and retreating. He told her about Gerald's will, which he had expected to benefit from, and then been told in August that Gerald had been reconsidering his arrangements, a phrase Philip quoted with the careful enunciation of someone who has turned it over many times. He told her about Sunday evening. He'd gone up to Black Hollow. He'd known it was Gerald's habit to sit in his study after supper. He had not told anyone he was going. He had wanted to speak to his uncle, about the will, about the debts, about whether there was any possibility of, and here he stopped and stared at his drink and said, "It doesn't matter what I wanted." Mrs. Patten answered the door. She said Gerald wasn't to be disturbed. She sent me away. He paused. He was dead by midnight. The way he said it. Not accusation, not guilt, something worse. The sound of a man who cannot stop reordering events and cannot make them come out differently. "Did Mrs. Patten say why he wasn't to be disturbed?" Miss Marple asked. She said he had a visitor. The bar noise continued around them. A dart thrown, a glass set down, 2 men talking about a tractor. Did she say who? No. Miss Marple took a small sip of her sherry. "And you told the police this?" A silence that answered the question. "Mr. Ashford," she said, very quietly, "you must tell the police you were there that evening." "If I tell them I was there, I know," she said. "But if you don't, and they discover it, and they will, because these things always come out, always, it will be considerably worse." He stared at her. She looked back at him with the particular steadiness of a woman who has told a great many people difficult truths and learned that the kindest way is also the most direct. "You have nothing to fear," she said. "If you have done nothing." It was not entirely reassuring, because both of them knew that innocence and safety were not always the same thing. But it was what she had, and she offered it honestly. He ordered another whiskey. She finished her sherry. Outside, the October night had come down cold and complete, and Black Hollow Road would be dark now, the kind of dark that discouraged walking. Miss Marple walked it anyway, her torch making a small moving circle on the chalk-pale surface, and thought about a locked study and a left-hand drawer that Diana Cole knew about and shouldn't, and about the visitor Mrs. Patten had turned Philip away for. Gerald Ashford had had a visitor on Sunday evening. He had been dead by midnight, and Mrs. Patten, who had answered that door, had not mentioned a visitor to anyone. Holt and Drew had occupied the same 3 rooms above the ironmonger's since 1923. Miss Marple knew this because the brass plate by the street door said "Established 1923" in letters that had been polished so many times they were beginning to lose their edges, and because the staircase smelled of the particular combination of linseed oil and old paper and something faintly rubbery that she associated, without quite knowing why, with professional discretion. Solicitors' offices smelled like this. They smelled of things being kept. She had not made an appointment. She had simply arrived at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning, given her name to the young man at the front desk. He was perhaps 23, with a cowlick he had attempted to subdue with something that had not worked, and said that she was an old acquaintance of the late Mr. Ashford's and had a small matter she hoped someone might be able to help her with. She was, she said, elderly and a little confused about certain things, property things. She had never been entirely comfortable with property things. The young man, whose name was Trent, was exactly the kind of person who found elderly, confused ladies both sympathetic and slightly wearying, and he managed both feelings with reasonable grace. He could not, he said, discuss Mr. Ashford's affairs. Professional confidentiality, he was sure she understood. "Of course," said Miss Marple warmly. "Of course, I wouldn't dream of asking. I only wondered. You see, Gerald had mentioned to me, some months ago, that he had been thinking about a small bequest. To a local charity, the Church Restoration Fund, possibly. And I thought, well, Reverend Capes is a personal friend, and if there were something of that kind, he would want to know to be grateful, or to understand if the arrangement had changed. One doesn't want to presume. Trent said he was sure he didn't know anything about that. No, naturally not. Only I did wonder. Mr. Ashford visited you recently, didn't he? I thought I saw his car outside, last week sometime. Monday, Trent said. And then stopped, with the expression of a young man who has answered a question before engaging the part of his brain that decides whether questions should be answered. "Monday," Miss Marple repeated, in a tone of mild, pleased interest, as if Monday confirmed something she had half remembered. "Yes, that would be right." "He was in good spirits, I hope." Trent looked at her. He looked at his desk. He was weighing, she could see, the question of how much he had already said against the question of how much it would cost him to say nothing further. He was, Trent said carefully, in perfectly good health and spirits when he came in on Monday morning. He had an appointment with Mr. Drew. He was here for approximately 40 minutes. That's all I can really say. 40 minutes, said Miss Marple. That does sound as though he had something substantial to attend to, not just a quick query. I really couldn't. No, of course not. You've been most helpful. She stood, gathered her bag, smiled at him with the full warmth of a woman who had been perfecting that particular smile for decades. One more very small thing, and then I'll leave you in peace. The appointment on Monday. Was that the first time Mr. Ashford had visited in recent months? Or had he been in before? Trent considered. This was a factual question, not a confidential one, and she could see him making that distinction. He came in twice in September, Trent said, and once in August. 4 visits in total since August. 4 visits, said Miss Marple. My goodness. He was thorough. She thanked Trent and went back down the linseed and rubber staircase and out onto the high street, where the October morning was bright and cold and smelled of bakery and diesel, and stood for a moment on the pavement and thought. 4 visits since August. The locks changed in August. The will reconsidered in August. Diana Cole arrived 6 weeks before the death, which was, by rough arithmetic, late September. Gerald had visited the solicitors in August, before Diana arrived, then twice more in September, then once on the morning of his death. A man rewriting his will was not remarkable. A man rewriting it 4 times in 3 months was a man who could not make up his mind, or a man whose mind kept being changed for him. Dr. Lovell's surgery was on the far side of the village green, in a converted cottage with a new extension built onto the back that had never quite matched the original building in either colour or ambition. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and old magazines and the faint sourness of a room in which anxious people spent a great deal of time. Miss Marple had telephoned that morning to make an appointment, citing her heart. This was not entirely dishonest. She had a mild arrhythmia that required periodic monitoring and gave her, when necessary, a legitimate reason to consult medical men without appearing to be investigating them. Dr. Lovell was 58. He had a square, weathered face and the hands of a man who had spent 30 years in general practice. Competent, calloused at the fingertips, still now when he chose. He listened to her chest with the focused detachment of a professional performing a task he could do without thinking, which left his face free, and Miss Marple, who had a talent for reading faces that had nothing to occupy them, read his with interest. He was under strain, not grief. She did not think it was grief. Something tighter than that, something that had been present for some time and had become more present in the last 3 days. She let him complete his examination. She said she had been a little concerned, sleeping in an unfamiliar bed, some palpitations. He nodded, asked the standard questions, wrote a note in his file. She mentioned Gerald Ashford while he was still writing, the timing deliberate, the tone conversational. Such a sad business. I understand you attended him. It must be difficult, losing a patient one has known for some time. Lovell finished his note before answering. Gerald Ashford had been my patient for 14 years. His heart condition was well documented. The death was not unexpected. No, said Miss Marple. I suppose not, though one is never quite prepared, even when one expects it. She paused. I believe he was on digoxin at some point. Or was that someone else? My memory for medications is terrible. The pen in Lovell's hand was still, not moving, not set down, just still. Many patients with Gerald's condition are managed with digoxin at some stage, he said. It's a common treatment. Is it? I know so little about these things. I remember reading somewhere, some magazine, I think, that the margin is very fine. Too little and it does nothing. Too much and... She shook her head. Dreadful to have to manage something so precise. It requires careful monitoring, Lovell said. His voice was level. His pen was still level. He was very good at this. Is there anything else I can help you with today, Miss Marple? She thanked him and paid her fee and left. Outside, walking back across the village green, she thought about what she had seen and what she had not seen. His fingers were stained, the first and second fingers of his right hand, the stain of a man who had smoked for many years. But there had been no smell of tobacco in the surgery, no smell at all, in fact, other than antiseptic. A man who had recently stopped, under stress, as people stopped or started things when the ground shifted under them. She thought about the mortgage. Mrs. Fellows had mentioned it the previous evening while peeling potatoes with the slightly guilty pleasure of someone sharing something they know they probably shouldn't. Gerald Ashford had held a small mortgage on Lovell's surgery extension, the new bit, the one that didn't match, and had, in September, sent a letter about it. Mrs. Fellow's source for this was the postmistress's sister-in-law, who cleaned for Lovell's wife, which was the kind of information chain that Miss Marple had long ago learned to trust, not for its accuracy regarding detail, but for its accuracy regarding fact. The letter had been sent. Something financial was in dispute between the two men. Motive, then? Method, possibly. A doctor and digoxin was not a difficult equation. And the death certificate, signed without hesitation. It was tidy. It was almost too tidy. Miss Marple sat down on the bench by the war memorial and took out her knitting. She always thought better when her hands were occupied. The needles were the colour of old bone, and the wool was grey, and the rhythm of the thing, in, over, through, off, was as steady and reliable as breathing. The cup. She kept returning to the cup. Lovell had signed the death certificate and had a financial motive and had access to digoxin. All of that was true. But Lovell had not washed a cocoa cup at midnight in Gerald Ashford's kitchen. Diana Cole had. She thought about Diana's hands around her teacup. Chalk white, steady, fine-boned. She thought about Diana's voice, saying the left-hand pedestal was always kept locked, knowing the study, knowing the desk, knowing the specific drawer. She thought about Diana arriving 6 weeks before Gerald's death and opening the front door of Black Hollow House as though she owned it. She thought about the Purvis family in Chipping Barton and the young woman who had come and stayed, and the elderly bachelor who had died of his heart, and the will that had favoured her. She had known the Purvis's cook. The cook had told her things. The cook had mentioned, among other things, that the young woman had always washed Mr. Tadworth's evening mug herself, said she liked to be helpful, said it in a voice that meant something else entirely. A routine, broken once, by one person, at midnight, is not nothing. It was Thursday afternoon when Inspector Farrow came to see her. He was 51, lean, with a careful manner and the kind of patience that came not from temperament, but from training. He had not dismissed her when she had telephoned the previous day to say she had some observations she thought might be of interest. He had not encouraged her either, but he had come, which was more than she had expected, and she respected him for it. They sat in Mrs. Fellowes' small sitting room. Mrs. Fellowes had removed herself to the garden with the pointed tact of a woman who wants to hear the conversation later, and knows she is more likely to do so if she pretends not to want it now. Miss Marple laid it out for him. Not all of it. She was careful about that. She gave him the bones of it. The digoxin, the financial connection, the unaccounted supply in Lovell's dispensary records, which Trent at the solicitors had mentioned in passing when she had called back that morning with a follow-up question, and which had been, she thought, more than Trent had intended to reveal. She watched Farrow's face as she spoke. He was listening, really listening, not the careful half-attention of a man waiting to explain why she was wrong. He had a small notebook, and he was not writing in it, which meant he was taking the information seriously enough to want it in his own words later. "The financial motive is clear," she said. "The access to digoxin is documented. If you look at the dispensary records, the death certificate was signed very quickly, and Dr. Lovell would have known exactly what a lethal dose produces, and exactly how to make it look like a cardiac event in a man who already had a cardiac history." Farrow looked at his notebook. He looked at Miss Marple. "That's a significant accusation," he said. "It's a significant observation," she said pleasantly. "I leave the accusation to you." He went away. She watched his car pull out from Mrs. Fellowes' gate and turn toward the village, and she sat for a while after it had gone, with her knitting in her lap and her needles not moving. The cup, she thought. The cup was still wrong. She had given Farrow something real, the digoxin, the mortgage, the certificate, and it was real, every piece of it. Lovell was hiding something. Lovell had motive and access, and she did not for a moment believe he was entirely innocent. But Lovell had not been in that kitchen at midnight, and the cup that was not in the rack at 8 o'clock on Monday morning was still not there, and no one had explained it. And Miss Marple had learned over a very long life that the things which did not have explanations were generally the things that mattered most. She picked up her knitting. In, over, through, off. She thought about grey eyes. She thought about a front door opened before a bell was rung. She thought about 6 weeks and 4 visits to a solicitor and a new will signed on Monday morning by a man who smelled of fresh ink and looked frightened at a village fete. Gerald Ashford had been frightened. He had also, in the end, done something about it. She thought about what that something was and what it had cost him, and her needles clicked faster, and the grey wool grew, and outside the October light began its early retreat, and the garden went dark, and Mrs. Fellowes came in from the cold smelling of earth, and cut stems and said, "Tea, please," said Miss Marple, and said nothing else. St. Cuthbert's churchyard was the kind of place that rewarded patience. Miss Marple had discovered this on her second morning in Wendenmere, when she had walked through it on her way to the post office, and found, without particularly looking, 3 things of interest. A gravestone for a Patten, Edward Patten, 1891 to 1944, beloved husband, which told her that Mrs. Patten's connection to this village went back at least a generation before her employment at Black Hollow. A fresh chrysanthemum laid on a grave belonging to one Margaret Ashford, 1881 to 1951, which told her that someone had been here recently and remembered, and a view, from the far corner near the yew tree, of the entire length of Black Hollow Road, which told her that anyone sitting in that corner could see, without being seen, exactly who walked to and from Black Hollow House. She went there now, on Friday morning, and sat on the low stone wall near the yew, and did not knit. Knitting was for thinking through familiar territory. This required something more like the blankness that comes just before sleep, a loosening of the deliberate mind, a willingness to let things arrange themselves. The morning smelled of turned earth and cold stone, and the thin, high smell of frost not quite arrived. Somewhere beyond the wall a bonfire had been lit. Leaves and garden waste, the sweet rotten smell of autumn clearing itself out. She had always found that smell clarifying. Something about the completeness of it. Things burned and were accounted for, and were done. She thought about Dr. Lovell. Farrow had telephoned that morning to Mrs. Fellowes' number with a message for Miss Marple to say that Dr. Lovell had been brought in for questioning. The dispensary records showed a discrepancy of 4 milligrams of digoxin over a 6-week period. Not a large amount. Enough. Lovell had retained a solicitor and was, the message said, cooperating. The investigation was proceeding. Miss Marple had thanked Mrs. Fellowes for passing on the message and had eaten her toast and had come here. The investigation was proceeding in the wrong direction. She had known it since Wednesday. She had known it more certainly on Thursday after Farrow left, when she sat with her cooling tea and turned the cup problem over and over and could not make it resolve into Lovell. Lovell had motive and access. Lovell had been careless with his records. Lovell was hiding a financial entanglement with a dead man, and that was the kind of secret that made innocent people behave guiltily, which was one of the more inconvenient facts of human nature. But Lovell had not been in the kitchen at midnight washing a cup, and someone had been. She had given Farrow a real thread, and Farrow was pulling it, and it was leading him somewhere, but not, she thought, to the right place. The thread was real. The destination was wrong. And while Farrow pulled it, the person who had stood at Gerald Ashford's kitchen sink in the dark, washing away the last evidence of what they had done, was still in Black Hollow House, still performing grief, still opening the front door as though they owned it. Miss Marple looked at Black Hollow Road. The road was empty. The chalk-pale surface caught the flat morning light and gave nothing back. She thought about Gerald Ashford at the fête, with his hand in his waistcoat pocket and fear on his face. She thought about a man who had visited his solicitors 4 times in 3 months. A man who changed his will in August, then changed it again in September, then came in on the Monday morning of his death and, according to Trent's unguarded Monday, spent 40 minutes signing something substantial. He had been trying to undo something. She thought about the Tadworth case. Mr. Tadworth of Chipping Barton, whose distant female relative had arrived in April and in whose company he had died in February. 10 months. Gerald had managed 6 weeks before. She stopped the thought and began it again differently. Gerald had lasted 6 weeks before he understood what was being done to him. He had understood it in time to go to his solicitors on the last morning of his life. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. It was the reason he was dead, not because he had been ill and aging and his heart was weak. Because he had finally decided to act, and someone could not allow it. The foxglove grew wild along the far edge of the churchyard. She had noticed it on her first visit and thought nothing of it. She thought about it now. Digitalis purpurea, the source of digoxin. It required extraction and concentration and patience, and it required access to a reasonably private kitchen over a period of several weeks, and it required the opportunity to administer something to a man who trusted the person giving it to him, Gerald's cocoa. Every night since 1987, a man who trusted the woman pouring it. She was walking back along Black Hollow Road when she saw Diana Cole coming the other way. Diana was dressed for the cold, a long dark coat, a scarf in burgundy wool, good boots that had been chosen for appearance and were managing the uneven road with less grace than she probably knew. She was walking quickly and her head was slightly down, and she did not see Miss Marple until they were perhaps 20 feet apart. Then she looked up. Her smile arrived in the correct amount of time. Not too fast, not too considered. Just the natural pace of a woman who is surprised but pleased. Miss Marple. She stopped. Are you walking far? It's cold for it. Just to the village, Miss Marple said. I find the cold clarifying. At my age one appreciates anything that clarifies. Diana smiled again. Her eyes, Miss Marple looked directly at them, which she did not always do, because direct looking made people conscious of being observed, were brown. A warm, specific brown, like the inside of a walnut shell. Miss Marple stopped. She had written grey in the notes she kept, in the small leather notebook she carried in her coat pocket. She had written grey because she was certain. She had looked at Diana Cole in the drawing room on Tuesday and thought, grey eyes, professional warmth, too much salt. She had been certain they were not grey. She did not say anything about this. She held Diana's gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was strictly conversational, and Diana, who was watching her with the careful attention of a woman who monitored reactions for a living, held it back steadily. Brown eyes, warm, watchful. "How are you finding Windermere?" Diana asked. "Very pleasant. Small villages suit me. Everyone knows everyone's business." Which sounds unpleasant, but is actually quite reassuring. There are no real secrets in the end. Something passed across Diana's face, so brief that Miss Marple would have missed it if she had not been looking for exactly that kind of brevity. "I suppose not," Diana said. "How long do you think you'll stay?" Miss Marple asked. "At Black Hollow, I mean, after the funeral and so on." "I'm not sure." The answer came a fraction too quickly. "There's a great deal to organize. Gerald didn't have anyone else, really." "No, except Philip, of course." A pause. "Except Philip," Diana agreed. They said their goodbyes with warmth on Diana's side and pleasantness on Miss Marple's, and walked on in their respective directions. And Miss Marple did not look back, because looking back would have told Diana something, and Diana she now understood with a cold and certain clarity, precisely the kind of person who could not be allowed to know what Miss Marple knew. She walked. Brown eyes. It was not the eye color that mattered. She had made a note, and the note was wrong, and the wrongness of it had made her really look, at Diana Cole for the first time since Tuesday, instead of watching the performance and cataloguing its elements. And when she looked, she saw not the grief and the handkerchief and the steady hands, but the watchfulness underneath all of it. The constant small monitoring, the way Diana's attention, even in conversation, was distributed, a portion to Miss Marple, a portion to the road behind her, a portion to something internal and ongoing. A woman running calculations. Not grief, management. Mrs. Patton was ironing when Miss Marple arrived at the kitchen door. The kitchen smelled of hot cotton and starch, and underneath the persistent medicinal trace that had been there on Monday. Stronger today, or perhaps Miss Marple was more attuned to it. She had been thinking about smells all week. The ink at the fête, the linseed at Holton Drew, the antiseptic at Lovell's, the sweet foxglove rot of the churchyard wall. Kitchens told you things. This kitchen told her that Mrs. Patton had been ironing since early morning. The pile of finished items was large, and that Mrs. Patton ironed when she was anxious, which Miss Marple knew because Mrs. Fellows had mentioned it, and Mrs. Fellows knew because the village knew, and the village knew because Mrs. Patton had been in it for 30 years. She sat down. She accepted tea. She said nothing of substance for a while, letting the rhythm of the ironing continue, because Mrs. Patton thought better when her hands were busy, and Miss Marple had learned to match her pace to the pace of the person she was listening to. "I've been thinking about Sunday evening," she said, after a while. The iron continued its path, slightly slower. Mr. Ashford's nephew came to the door. Miss Marple said, "Philip, he told me you sent him away, that Gerald had a visitor." Mrs. Patton set the iron upright. She did not look at Miss Marple. She picked up the shirt she had been working on and turned it, and laid it flat, and picked the iron up again. "He wasn't to be disturbed," she said. "That's what I was told." "By whom?" A long pause. The iron moved in slow, precise strokes. "Miss Cole came to me in the afternoon," Mrs. Patton said finally. "She said Mr. Gerald was expecting someone. "A private visitor," she said. "Business matters." He didn't want to be interrupted. She asked me to turn away anyone who called that evening. Miss Marple looked at her hands in her lap. "And did a visitor come?" "Not that I saw." She paused. "I was in my room by 9. I didn't hear the bell." "But you heard the tap," Miss Marple said. The iron stopped. Mrs. Patten stood with her back to Miss Marple and her hand flat on the ironing board and said nothing for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a wood pigeon said its 3-note thing and was silent. "The pipes in this house," Mrs. Patten said, carefully, "make a noise when the kitchen tap is run. A particular noise. I've heard it for 30 years. She paused. "I heard it it was past midnight. I thought it was the pipes settling." She turned around. Her face was the face of a woman who has known something for 5 days and has been carrying it the way you carry something fragile across a long room. Very carefully, not looking at it, because looking at it might mean dropping it. "I didn't want to think about it," she said. "I know," said Miss Marple. "She was always helpful, always doing little things. Making his cocoa. She said she liked to. She said he reminded her of her grandfather." Mrs. Patten's voice held the particular flatness of a woman who now heard those words very differently than when they had first been spoken. "I should have." "No," Miss Marple said, and she meant it entirely. "You should not have known. You were not meant to know. The whole purpose was that you should not know." Mrs. Patten sat down heavily in the chair across the table. The medicinal smell was stronger here. Miss Marple looked at the shelf above the range. Dried herbs in glass jars, the usual things, thyme and rosemary and bay. And one jar, pushed slightly back, slightly apart from the others, that she did not recognize. She did not say anything about it. Not yet. "Mrs. Patten," she said. "The visitor on Sunday evening, the one Miss Cole told you to expect. Did you believe there was such a visitor? At the time, I mean." Mrs. Patten was quiet. "I thought it was her way of making sure Philip couldn't speak to him," she said at last. "I thought she was protecting. I thought she was managing things. The way she always managed things." She stopped. "I was angry with Philip. He shouldn't have come unannounced like that. In that state. I was protecting Mr. Gerald from a difficult scene." "You were," Miss Marple said. "That is exactly what she wanted you to believe you were doing." The kitchen was very still. Mrs. Patten looked at the table, at her own hands spread flat on the ironing board cloth she'd brought to the table without noticing. "He signed a new will on Monday morning," Miss Marple said, quietly. "Before he died, he went to Holt and Drew and signed something. He was in good spirits. He had decided to do something about his situation." Mrs. Patten raised her eyes. "She didn't know," Miss Marple said. "She didn't know he'd done it. That is the thing she miscalculated. She administered the final dose on Sunday evening, before he had a chance to. She thought she was preventing it. But he had already acted. On Sunday morning, while she was occupied elsewhere, he had telephoned Trent and made the Monday appointment. She was 1 day too late." Silence. Then Mrs. Patten said, in a very small voice, "So Philip inherits," Miss Marple said. "Yes. She killed Gerald Ashford to preserve a will that Gerald had already replaced. The irony of it sat between them in the quiet kitchen, unadorned." Mrs. Patten pressed her hand to her mouth. Outside, the bonfire smell had drifted this far, sweet and final, the smell of things being cleared. The wood pigeon began again, its 3-note observation, as reliable and unremarkable as the ticking of the clock, as the scratch of a pen signing a name, as the particular sound of a tap running in the dark when everyone is supposed to be asleep. Inspector Farrow arrived at 9 o'clock, which told Miss Marple 2 things: that he was a man who kept Saturday hours when a case required it, and that he had slept badly. The second she inferred from the slight tightness around his jaw, and the fact that his coat was buttoned incorrectly, 3rd button into 4th buttonhole, a small diagonal pull at the lapel that he hadn't noticed or hadn't cared to correct. She had seen that kind of dressing before. It was the dressing of a man whose mind had been elsewhere since before he opened his wardrobe. She had telephoned him the previous evening. She had said, in her most peaceable voice, that she wondered if he might spare her 20 minutes on Saturday morning, and that she thought she had been. She paused here, giving the pause the weight of a woman choosing her words carefully, somewhat hasty in her earlier observations about Dr. Lovell. Farrow had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said he would come at 9. He sat now in Mrs. Fellowes' sitting room with a cup of tea he was not drinking, and he looked at Miss Marple with the expression of a man who has spent 3 days pursuing something and is not entirely certain he wants to be told he has been pursuing it in the wrong direction. She understood. She did not rush. "Dr. Lovell," she said, "is hiding something. I want to be clear about that. The financial entanglement with Gerald was real. The discrepancy in the dispensary records is real. He signed that death certificate quickly and without question, and his reasons for doing so were not entirely professional." Farrow nodded once. "But," Miss Marple said, "a man who signs a death certificate carelessly because a dead patient can no longer call in a mortgage is not the same as a man who caused the death. Lovell was relieved when Gerald died. That is not the same as being responsible." She let that settle. "The cup," she said. Farrow looked at her. "Gerald Ashford took cocoa every evening. Mrs. Patton washed up every morning at 8 o'clock. She has told me herself, perfectly regular about it. She has been regular about it for 30 years. On Monday morning, the morning after Gerald died, I visited the kitchen. The draining rack held every item from the previous evening's use. Every item except one." "The cocoa cup?" Farrow said. "The cocoa cup, which means someone washed it before Mrs. Patton's 8 o'clock. The only person in Black Hollow House that night, apart from Mrs. Patton and the dead man, was Diana Cole." Farrow was listening in the way that good policemen listen, without expression, without interruption, with the quality of attention that records rather than reacts. Mrs. Patton heard the kitchen tap running at past midnight. She assumed it was the pipes. It was not the pipes. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. A woman who has just administered a lethal dose of digoxin in a cup of cocoa has one immediate practical problem: the cup. If the cup is tested and in a properly conducted post-mortem, it would be the residue of the drug is traceable. She washed it herself. She rinsed it carefully, and she put it, not in the rack where Mrs. Patton would see it in the morning, and perhaps wonder why she hadn't done it herself, but away, in the cupboard, where it belonged. "We'd need to test the cup," Farrow said. "You would, and I think you'll find it very clean indeed. Cleaner than the others." She paused. "People who wash away evidence are always too thorough. A cup washed in normal daily use has traces. Tea residue at the rim, slight mineral deposit from the water. A cup washed with the specific purpose of removing something has none of those things. It has been attended to." Farrow picked up his tea, set it down again. "The digoxin," he said. "Foxglove grows in the churchyard, along the north wall. It has been harvested, recently I think. Though I am not a botanist, there is a jar on Mrs. Patton's herb shelf, pushed slightly back, that does not belong to Mrs. Patton's usual collection. She was not aware of it. I did not draw her attention to it." Miss Marple met Farrow's eyes. "I thought that was better left to you. And the will." Gerald visited Holton Drew 4 times between August and the morning of his death. The will was redrawn in August, before Diana Cole arrived. Redrawn again twice in September, after her arrival, in her favor, I believe, or in favor of arrangements that benefited her. On Sunday morning, while Diana Cole was occupied, he telephoned and made an appointment for Monday. He went on Monday morning and spent 40 minutes signing something. He was, Trent told me, in good spirits. Farrow said, "The new will removes Diana Cole." "I believe so. Philip Ashford is the sole beneficiary under the original will, and I believe under the final one. Diana did not know he had made the appointment. She administered the final dose on Sunday evening. Mrs. Patton had been instructed to admit no callers, to ensure Gerald had no opportunity to speak privately to anyone, Philip in particular. Diana believed she was acting before the new will could be signed. Miss Marple's voice was steady and quiet and without drama. She was one day too late. Gerald had already acted. She killed him to preserve a will that no longer existed. The sitting room was very quiet. Outside, a car went down the lane. Mrs. Fellowes' cat walked across the window ledge with the indifferent composure of a creature that has no interest in the affairs of solicitors or murderers. "There's the question of identity," Farrow said. "Diana Cole claims a family connection to the Ashfords. Yes, I think you will find, when you look, that the connection is considerably more distant than claimed, or not present at all. Gerald was a retired solicitor. He was accustomed to verifying such things. In August, I believe he began to verify, and found something that did not satisfy him. That is when he first went to Holt and Drew." Farrow was looking at his notebook. He had been writing since the cup. "There is one more thing," Miss Marple said. He looked up. "Philip Ashford was at Black Hollow House on Sunday evening. He came unannounced. Mrs. Patton turned him away on Diana's instruction, believing she was protecting Gerald from an unpleasant scene. Philip has not told you this because he is frightened and somewhat foolish and did not think it would help him." She paused. "It was, I think, the thing that most worried me, that Philip might be made to carry this." Diana had constructed it very neatly. A desperate nephew, deeply in debt, turned away from the door on the evening of his uncle's death. It tells a story. It was supposed to tell a story. Farrow closed his notebook. He sat for a moment, and Miss Marple sat with him, and neither of them said anything, because there was a kind of decency in pausing before the machinery of consequence was set in motion. A man was dead. A young woman had killed him with patience and precision and 6 weeks of performed warmth. These were not abstract facts. Then Farrow stood and buttoned his coat, still diagonal, she noticed, still wrong, and picked up his hat. "I'll need a formal statement," he said. "Of course. This afternoon, if you're available. I shall be in all afternoon." He moved toward the door. At the threshold he stopped, not quite turning back, in the way of a man who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. "You said Dr. Lovell was hiding something," he said. "The dispensary records." "Yes. Not the murder, but something." "Yes," Miss Marple said again. "I think you'll find the discrepancy relates to another patient, not Gerald Ashford. A patient for whom the digoxin was being managed in a way that perhaps wasn't entirely by the book. Chronic pain, possibly. Or a family member. Lovell is not a bad man. He is a man who has made quiet accommodations for people he cares about and has been careless about the paperwork." She considered. "The mortgage is the uglier part. He was glad Gerald died. I think he will have to live with that." Farrow nodded. He went. Miss Marple heard the front door close. She heard his car start on the second attempt, the engine reluctant in the cold, and pull away down the lane. She heard Mrs. Fellowes come in from the kitchen with 2 fresh cups of tea, because Mrs. Fellowes had been listening from the kitchen and had timed her entrance with the precision of a woman who had been doing exactly this for 30 years. "Well," said Mrs. Fellowes. "Yes," said Miss Marple. She accepted her tea. She picked up her knitting from the basket beside the chair. The grey gloves, one completed, one half finished, the needles the colour of chalk in the pale morning light. She began where she had left off. In, over, through, off. Diana Cole was taken in for questioning at 11 o'clock that morning. Miss Marple did not see this happen. She was in Mrs. Fellowes' sitting room, knitting. But Mrs. Fellowes' neighbour, who had been deadheading roses in the front garden with rather more dedication than the season required, reported it in full by 11:30. Diana, walking to the police car with the same composure she had brought to everything, the dark coat, the burgundy scarf, the expression of a woman who had not yet decided what her face should be doing. The jar from Mrs. Patton's herb shelf was collected at noon. The cocoa cup, found in the back of the correct cupboard, exactly where Miss Marple had suggested it might be, was collected at 12:30. Holt and Drew confirmed the Monday will at 2 o'clock. Philip Ashford, as Miss Marple had said, was the sole beneficiary. Diana Cole was not mentioned, had never, under the final will, been mentioned at all. Farrow came for Miss Marple's statement at 3. He sat in the same chair he had sat in that morning and asked his questions with precision and wrote her answers with care, and at the end he looked at what he had written and looked at Miss Marple and said, with the slightly awkward honesty of a man paying a debt he hadn't expected to owe, "This would have gone badly wrong without you." "Oh, I don't know," Miss Marple said. "You would have got there." He looked as though he was not entirely certain this was true, but he accepted it with good grace, which she respected. The following Monday, the Windermere Gazette carried a brief account of an arrest in connection with the death of Gerald Ashford. It named Inspector Farrow. It described his patient accumulation of forensic and documentary evidence. It mentioned in passing that several local residents had assisted with inquiries. Mrs. Fellows read it aloud at breakfast, with the expression of a woman exercising considerable restraint. Miss Marple spread marmalade on her toast. "Very thorough," she said. "Inspector Farrow is a thorough man." She left Windermere on Wednesday morning. Philip Ashford came to Mrs. Fellows' cottage the afternoon before, looking like a man who had been frightened for a long time, and was beginning, cautiously, to stop. He was sober. He sat in the sitting room and looked at his hands and said he understood she had, that without her. He stopped twice before he found a sentence that fit. "I don't know what to say," he said finally. "You don't need to say anything," Miss Marple told him. "What you need to do is considerably more practical. Pay the debts. Sell the car if you have to. Don't borrow against Black Hollow. It's a good property and it will be worth more in 5 years than it is today. And find something useful to do with yourself, Mr. Ashford. Your uncle was a solitary man and it made him vulnerable. Don't make the same arrangement with your life." Philip looked at her. "That's very direct," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. He left. Mrs. Fellows made remarks about him from the kitchen that were not entirely uncharitable. That evening, Miss Marple packed her bag with the economy of long practice. She had been packing and unpacking bags for 70 years and had reduced the process to its essentials, and sat for a while by the window with the finished grey gloves in her lap and the village of Windermere going dark outside. She thought about Gerald Ashford at the fête, the hand in the waistcoat pocket, the chalk-dry fear on his face, the specific fear of a man who has understood something too late and is trying, in what time remains, to put it right. He had put it right. That mattered. He had been afraid, and he had been dying, and he had still got up on Sunday morning and made a telephone call and walked into Holt and Drew on Monday morning and signed his name. Whatever else had been taken from him, that had not been taken. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, had a habit of arriving late. It moved at its own pace and through its own channels, and it did not, as a rule, consult anyone about its timing. But it was thorough, in the end. It found the cup. It found the jar. It found the will, signed in a solicitor's office by a frightened old man who had decided, on the last morning of his life, to stop being afraid. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. She picked up her knitting bag. She checked the window latch. She turned off the lamp. Outside, Black Hollow Road ran pale and empty in the November dark, and Black Hollow House sat at the end of it with its lights off and its gates standing open, waiting, as old houses do, with the patient and entirely impersonal endurance of things that have outlasted everyone who ever lived in them and will outlast everyone who comes next. Miss Marple went to bed.